Hello, everybody. I am Joe Harper, and this is Reformed Truther Ministries. Reformed Truther Ministries is a show that is walking through the narrative of Scripture and is unafraid to talk about topics found on the path less traveled. So, as we have been going through this story, we've been going through the human story, the gospel story, the story that we find in our Bibles. We have been going through the antediluvian world. What in the antediluvian world is just another term for the pre-flood world. And we spent 2 weeks going through who are the Nephilim, who are these fallen angels called the Watchers. We described the big picture of what is going on with that. But in today's broadcast, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to focus in specifically on Noah. And we're going to focus in on the ministry of Noah. That is the title of today's broadcast, the ministry of Noah. And what we're going to see here in this study is we're going to see a man who, by the grace of God, was a good man, who was a righteous man, who was a faithful man in the midst of very difficult times. He was a man who served the Lord when the world, the whole world for the most part, was falling into deeper and deeper sin, deeper and deeper rebellion against God. And he was a man who not only was faithful to the warnings and the promises that God had gave him, which led him to build this ark, but he was a man who righteously preached the gospel, to preach the warnings of the coming judgment to come. And he continued on that path even in the midst of people not listening to him. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we're really going to come right up to the Great Flood. And Noah is such a prominent figure for us. We know that the Great Flood is often called the Great Flood of Noah because it's associated with Noah and this ark that he built. And he built this ark, and all of the animals come onto it, and his family comes onto it. And at the end of this story, they're the only ones who escape the old world. And the entire old world is destroyed by water. So we're really coming up to the culmination, to the finishing point of this story of the antediluvian world. And as we're going to move forward in this story in the weeks to come, as we're going to come to the post-flood world, we're going to see that there's ripple effects that still come through. The implications of what happened at this time in history continue on with us. But this particular chapter of the story is going to come to a close, and we're going to come to a new chapter where humanity will begin to repopulate the earth again, and that will eventually lead us to the Tower of Babel event. So that's really where we're at in this story. But focusing in again on the ministry of Noah, I want to start with 2 verses from the New Testament that give us a lot of very useful information about Noah before we return to the book of Genesis, and we'll read more about him there as well. But if we go to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, we have a very excellent description of the life of Noah. And the greater context of this in 2 Peter 2:4, it's talking about the judgment that came on the old world. And we've talked about this passage of Scripture in the weeks that we've been going through this. But verse 5 says, and spared not, this is referring to what God did, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So here we see that Noah is talked about not just as this man who heeded the warnings of God, not just a man who built the ark, even though he did those things as well, but he is specifically described as a preacher of righteousness. He was preaching the ways of God. He was preaching the promises of the coming one that we talked about that was described in Genesis 3:15, which we now know is Jesus Christ. He was preaching the way of following the Lord, of repenting from sins, turning back to the Lord. And as we're going to see as this story plays out, he preached this message in the midst of people not heeding it and not listening to it. So that gives us a lot of very helpful information about the life of Noah. And if we turn to the book of Hebrews and we go to Hebrews chapter 11, we get even more information about the life of Noah. And in Hebrews 11, verse 7, it says, by faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear and prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. So we see that Noah is described as a man who had great faith. And you think about this, you think about the implications of this. God told him that he was going to be living in a world that was going to be destroyed. God said to him, this great flood is coming. And even though it's a very powerful thing to be told something that's going to happen by the true and living God, he's being told that something's going to happen that had never happened before in history. And he's literally being told, if we want to use it in modern terms, the apocalypse is coming, prepare for it. And you can imagine he heeded that warning by faith. We are told that Noah had great faith. And as he preached this message of what was going to come, the general reception, by and large, is that he was ignored, he was ridiculed, he was mocked, he was dismissed. To whatever degree people expressed that disagreement with his message, the bottom line is that his message was not heeded. But Noah, because he had faith in what God had told him, and he had faith in the God who had told it to him, he had a godly fear to prepare himself for the trouble that was coming. A wise man sees trouble and hides himself, and that's exactly what Noah did. He had faith that what God told him was true, and even after having that power, because we know this, that sometimes God will put a promise in front of us, and in the moment it may seem powerful and strong, but as the days go on, because of our lack of faith, our doubt, sometimes we forget and we doubt the things that God has put in front of us. And we see this all throughout the biblical narrative. We think of what God said to Abraham, where he would have this son, and he has these powerful and intimate encounters with God, where God puts all of these promises in front of Abraham. But what does Abraham do? He doubts at times. Even he's called the father of faith in the Bible, a man of great faith. But this is why he often gets into trouble, and he ends up having sex with Hagar, and it leads to the birth of Ishmael, and he gets himself into all sorts of trouble because he doubts the promises of God. And that's another man of great faith. So these are things that we all do at times. We all fall when we don't lift up that shield of faith, when we don't walk in faith. And that's why Noah is an excellent example for us of somebody who had great faith and heeded the warnings of God. So there's a couple more lessons that we can pull out from Noah. We see here, and I've already mentioned a few of them. One, that we see that Noah was a faithful servant in the midst of the day of small things. He was living in a day where there were not many true believers on the earth. He was a faithful servant in the midst of times where there was exceedingly great rebellion. There was exceedingly great wickedness on the earth. It talks about in Genesis how the hearts of men were continually upon evil. They were thinking of new ways to sin. Their hearts were constantly on the things of sin and evil. And we see that Noah was faithful even in the midst of that. And that's an encouragement to us as Christians, because we live in wicked times right now. So there's encouragement to be found by studying the life of Noah. And we also see that Noah was a faithful servant in the midst of disappointments and heartache. And I think we can pull this out from what we read in 2 Peter 2:5, because it says that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. And anybody who's going to be a preacher in any capacity, you're always going to have hope that people will heed your message. So we can think through what Noah's life would have looked like, his day-to-day. He was spent a lot of his time building the ark, and perhaps his family helped him. Perhaps he hired others to help him, so he would have overseen that project. But in the midst of that work that he was doing, he would have traded his time between that and preaching this message of righteousness. That would have been what Noah's life would have looked like. And I'm sure that in his day-to-day, he had people that he was holding out hope for, that they would heed the message and get on the ark with him. We don't know what the day-to-day looked like. We don't know the specifics. But we know that anybody who preaches, there's always people who you're hoping are going to hear the message. And I'm sure that Noah had that in his own life and in his own preaching, in his own ministry of righteousness, people that he was praying for, people who he was hoping would see the truth. But we know how the story ends. The only people who get on the ark with him apart from those animals, is his family. It's his wife, his sons, and the wives of his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So there had to have been disappointments. There had to have been heartache. There had to have been troubles and trials. But Noah remained faithful in the midst of all of that. So as Christians, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the life of Noah. And there's a lot of inspiration that we can find from Noah, who had a mighty prophetic and preaching ministry in the midst of dark times. And that's something that we can really learn a lot from. And if there's one more lesson we can pull out of this, that Noah is an excellent biblical figure to look to for the Christian who finds himself dealing with loneliness. Because many Christians in our day find themselves struggling with loneliness, because at times, in the times we're living in, it can feel you have faithful Christians who are mature, who have learned more about the things of God, who have learned more about how the world really is. They've seen the sin in the world. They've seen some of the issues in the church. And at times, the Christian remnant can feel quite small. And even if you go to, say, the Christian truth community, people who really care about truth really passionately, that can be a very small world. Many Christians today, they have trouble finding good biblical churches with faithful pastors and elders. It can be difficult to find good fellowship. It feels like there are few Christian friends to be found, few comrades in arms, few people who understand the mission and the struggles and the trials facing the faithful Christian today. Many Christians feel this way. And this is why we can find a lot of inspiration and a lot of lessons we can pull from Noah, because Noah was faithful in the midst of serving in a world that had few true believers. He came from that line of Methuselah and Enoch, and it also goes back to Seth. That community of faithful servants had been on the earth all the way back to the times of Cain and Abel and back to Adam and Eve, but that remnant had gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So Noah, he had his wife, he had fellowship there, he had his sons, and we probably know that not even all three of his sons were probably truly serving the Lord, because we know what happens when we get to Ham and all of that happens later after the flood. But what we know is that Noah, he had some comrades, he had some companions, but he had few people who really understood what he was trying to do, and he had few people in his life who really understood his walk with the Lord and understood the mission that the Lord had given to him. And I'm certain that would have been at times a very lonely thing. And so Christians, there's so much we can learn from the life of Noah. Noah is such a great figure to study. And I'm pulling some of these lessons out because it's a great reminder for us that there's a lot more, as we've talked about all these crazy things with the flood and with these giants and the Nephilim. There's a lot more going on when we look at some of these biblical characters like Enoch and Noah. There's so much more that we can pull out of this. And just to say it one more time before we move forward, many Christians do feel this way, that the remnant is really quite small in the days we're living in. And we also learn, and I think Noah probably learned this as well, that in the increase of wisdom there is sorrow. Because when God grows a Christian in grace, in wisdom and knowledge, you see more what the Bible says. You see more of what sin is. You see your sin. You see sin around you, and you learn more and more what the world is really like. And you see the sinfulness of the world. You see the darkness of the world. Growing in wisdom can be a painful experience, because you do learn, as the Lord grows you in grace, that there are few people who are walking that narrow path of walking in faith. And that's not intended to be a proud or a boastful statement. It's just true that there are not as many faithful Christians on the earth as one would think. And Joe, and people would say, well, Joe, there's still a lot of evangelical Christians. And in a sense, yes, that's true. But there are a lot of issues in the churches today. There are a lot of issues where oftentimes mature Christians struggle to find people to have good fellowship with. And so that's why we can find a lot of encouragement from Noah. But moving forward, we're going to go now to the book of Genesis, and we're going to go to Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to read a little bit more of Noah's story here in the book of Genesis with verses 5. So we now come to verses 5 through 17 of Genesis chapter 6, and I'm going to start there. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repented me that I have made them. And Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And make thee an ark of gopher wood. Room shalt thou make in the ark, and thou shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, and the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. And behold, I, even I, shall do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. So we have a lot here. We see, first off, that humanity's hearts are on evil continually. So they have fallen into deep sin, rebellion, and corruption. And we see that it talks about how the Lord is expressing his displeasure with humanity's rebellion. So that is really where we are at this point. And we see that Noah, just as we read in the New Testament, he is a just man. He is perfect in his generations. I'm going to break that down more in just a second. But he heeds the warning of God, and the earth had been filled with violence. That's one of the key sins that's highlighted. And he makes this ark of gopher wood, and it talks about how he uses pitch. And it's interesting how we even have the dimensions, even though there's debate about what a cubit is, but it talks about the breadth of it being 50 cubits, the height of it being 30 cubits. It talks about the windows that it has and the door, and how it even has lower story, second story, third stories. It's actually described, this ark, in a lot of detail, which is very interesting, and it's very cool. And a lot of Christian ministries have really gotten into the nitty-gritty of this and talked about how the ark would have looked and how it would have functioned. But there's a lot going on there. But I want to break down a little bit about going back to some of the material we talked about in the past 2 weeks about how there was the Nephilim and how the Watchers brought about this genetic corruption between the various kinds of animals, between human and animals, and they were mixing with the kinds of animals. And we talked about this in the book of Enoch. And even though some people may find this controversial, it gives us a lot of understanding of what's going on at verse 9. Because it says that these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man, which that's talking about being morally upright by the grace of God. But it also talks about how he's perfect in his generations. Now, do we believe that that's talking about him being morally perfect? I don't think so. I think the just man, that part is certainly talking about being morally upright and righteous. But it's also talking about how Noah, in the midst of all of this genetic chaos that was going on that's described in the book of Enoch, that him and his family were part of the remnant of humanity that had not been corrupted. And this is the same thing that's going on with these animals being brought 2 by 2. There's a lot of genetic corruption that had been going on in the antediluvian world, that the Watchers, these fallen angels, had done all sorts of crazy and evil things. And that's really what we come to, is that there's really intentionality on what God is doing here. He's taking all of these various kinds of animals and he's putting them onto this ark. But that's the same thing that's going on with Noah. Now, Noah is a just man. He is a morally upright man. That's emphasized in the text. But we also need to understand that he's chosen because God has preserved a remnant of humanity that's kept away from all this chaos that's been going on with the Nephilim and the mixing of the kinds and all that stuff that we talked about the past 2 weeks. Noah's been preserved from that. And that's kind of it's not an either or thing, it's a both and thing. And even though some people would not like to see those implications from the text, that is what is there. And those are things that we really need to understand. And if we read verses 18 through 22 to finish out Genesis chapter 6, we see this kind of come into greater detail with greater context. But with thee I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee, and they shall be male and female. Of fowls after their kind, of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing after his kind, 2 of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. And take thou unto thee all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee. It shall be for food for thee and for them. And this did Noah do according to all that God has commanded him. We kind of see here how you're going, but it kind of comes full circle to where Adam was at in the garden. You start having 2 of every kind in the garden again. We remember that Adam named all the animals. Now, Noah doesn't name these animals, but we see all these animals coming in their 2s, male and female, back to the ark, because this is what's going to start the world over. And we're going to see this more when we get to the Noahic covenant, that God is really extending this out. He's really extending this out even further. And that's what's going on, is that he is really saying that the resetting of the world really harkens back to the original creation of the world with Adam, which is very, very interesting. And so, anyways, we're going to come here to we're going to come to Genesis chapter 7. What we're going to get at here is we're going to see that the flood is going to come. And we're going to finally see this destruction of the world. And we've been building to this climax over 3 weeks. And if I start at Genesis chapter 7 and we read verses 1 through 7, and this reads, And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of the beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Of fowls of the air by 7s, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of the earth. And yet 7 days will I cause it to rain upon the earth, 40 days and 40 nights. Every living substance that I have made I will destroy from off the face of the earth. And Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of the waters was upon the earth. And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark, because of the waters of the flood. So that's all very interesting. And we see this, we're going to talk about these 40 days here. We see it also emphasized in verses 17 and 18, where it says, And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted upon the earth, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went in upon the face of the waters. And verse 19 says, And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. So there is a lot going on here with this text. And really, it's amazing here that what we're going to see, there's so much information that we can glean here from Genesis chapter 7. I mean, even if we just start with the simplicity of Noah being 600 years, and we haven't talked about this much yet, but we look at the antediluvian patriarchs. We look at the saints that were serving upon the earth, and this would have been more common for humanity. They had much, much longer lifespans in the antediluvian world than in the post-diluvian world, which is something that is very interesting to think about. And another thing that's very interesting to think about is how different the climate would have been. In the world of the antediluvian world, I believe, looked very, very different than what the world, generally speaking, looks like today. I think there was far greater diversity of plant life at that time. There was a far greater diversity of animal life, and we can debate what animals were there and what's not. But there was a massive die-off of plant and animal life. And even though God preserved various kinds that he wanted to come through to the post-flood world, there's a lot of diversity of things that died off. And really, when we understand what's going on with the text of Genesis 7, where it talks about how the windows of heaven were opened up and the waters below rose up, it actually, another comment I want to make, even though we're not going to get into this too much, the way that the flood is described in the Bible really makes a lot more sense in light of biblical cosmology. And if you want to know what I'm getting at with that, you can go back to the second broadcast that we did on this channel. But that's what is talked about, how everything was destroyed upon the face of the earth. Everything comes because the waters rise up and the windows of heaven come down, and we're told that it rains for 40 days and 40 nights upon the earth, which is something that is very, very fascinating. And I want to talk a little bit about these 40 days and 40 nights as well, because this number of 40, it comes up a lot in the biblical narrative, and it's usually associated with some type of a period of waiting. It's usually associated with the period of waiting on the Lord to bring through some type of a promise. And here's just a couple examples of that. The 40 days and 40 nights where the waters of the rains in the flood, we just read that. 40 years is the biblical definition of a generation. A new generation comes at 40 years. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness in Midian, waiting before he is called to be a prophet of God. So we know that Moses leaves Egypt and that he goes and he is a shepherd in Midian for a period of 40 years until he is called to go back and lead the Exodus. That's a great example of this. The Israelites, due to their grumbling and due to their disobedience to the Lord, they spend 40 years in the Sinai wilderness, and until a new generation is risen up to lead them into Canaan. We know that Jesus fasted 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. So this number of 40, we see it in multiple places in the scriptures, and we find this with other numbers as well. When we get to the Tower of Babel, we'll talk about how we see the number 70, the 70 nations. And that's even connected to the 70 people who were commissioned at the time when the gospel is supposed to go out and be preached. So there are other numbers we see. 7's a big number in the Bible. And I think God does this to show us how interconnected the scriptures are. And some people have gotten way too far into numerology and all of that. You can take this way farther than you should. But these numbers are there to show us that God has a plan in the Bible, and he brings these same things up. These things are interconnected for a purpose. God is trying to teach us something through this. He's trying to tell us something through this. And some of the lessons we learn from 40, because we know that these rains prevail for 40 days and 40 nights, and then the waters prevail for 150 days. We have all this information. But the number 40 is so fascinating in the scripture. And what we're seeing here is that God is reminding us with these numbers being connected in Scripture, one, that he's sovereign over everything. There's not a single thing that happens in his providence that he is not in control of. Everything has been foreordained by the hand of God. That's why we have prophecies in the Bible. Everything has been foreordained by God's hand. So, and that brings me to my second point. Everything happens on God's perfect prophetic timetable. Everything happens in God's timing. One day is as 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a single day. And often we find ourselves wanting things to happen on our own timetable when we really should be reminded that everything happens on God's good, perfect timetable. And those are things that we all find that from these numbers of 40. So that really is what some things that we can pull out from the text of Genesis chapter 7. And as we're really going to go into the broadcast next week, we're going to get into more of the Noahic covenant. We're going to get into this recommissioning of the earth, and we're going to begin to move toward the Tower of Babel event. And we're going to move into the repopulating of the earth. And we'll talk more about some of the events that go on with Noah's sons as well. And we're going to talk about all of that. But one of the big questions really is we're kind of coming to the conclusion of what is happening with Genesis chapter 6 is we need to really answer one more question regarding the giants. And we we need to ask because if we go back to what we read before in Genesis chapter 6 verse 4, where it says there were giants in the earth in those days and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them, the same became mighty men which were old, men of renown. Well, the point that we want to emphasize here is the question we want to answer is, if all those giants are destroyed in the flood, how do they come back after the flood? And that's a really good question, because when we get to the times of Abraham, we're going to see references to giants again in Canaan, in the promised land. And we're also going to see when we get to the point where the Israelites invade, there's giants in Canaan there as well. And we have many prominent giants mentioned, some of which we've already talked about, such as Og, king of Bashan, or Goliath is obviously one of the most famous giants in history. There's a lot of giants. And as we've seen how it talks about how the whole face of the earth under heaven was consumed by water, we have to ask the question of how do these giants reappear? And there's really three prominent theories that come through, and I'll tell you which one I lean to, but I'm not super dogmatic on these points. But I just want to lay out this material so that people can start to begin to understand, or at least begin to think through, how do these giants appear again after the flood. And the first theory is what is called the sons of, the genetic, it would be kind of a carrier theory, where the sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they have their three wives. And the theory would go something like this, that the three wives, even though they were not themselves Nephilim, they would have had some of that genetic material in them, and kind of like a passive carrier, like a genetic trait that would come through, and that therefore when the earth begins to be repopulated, that this genetic trait of the Nephilim ends up reappearing on the earth. So that would be one theory, that genetic material comes through the ark, through the wives of the sons of Noah, and then as the earth begins to repopulate, they find it once again. That is one theory. And the potential problem, or the potential pushback you would get with that theory is, well, if the whole point of the ark is that it's supposed to be kind of a place that's been kept genetically pure from all that chaos that we've talked about with the antediluvian world, then why does God allow that to happen? And that's a fair question. Some people have said that objection doesn't hold water. Some people think it does hold water, but that would be the first of the three views. The second view is that there would be a second angelic incursion. So the idea here would be that just as angels cohabitated with women in the pre-flood world, that this could happen again in some way, shape, or form in the post-flood world, and therefore you'd get giants reintroduced. But then the potential problem or question that you come up with that one would be, well, if the angels were judged so severely the first time, then why is this happening again? Like, wouldn't God bring the second judgment down just as strongly? And that is the potential pushback you get for that view. And then there's a third view that some of these giants somehow survived by perhaps going under the earth. And there's a lot of stuff that is going on. There's a lot more in the Bible that we could talk about, the underworld, about Sheol, about what's going on under the earth. And it's fascinating in our own day how there have been a lot of, we continue to find deeper and deeper tunnels, deeper and deeper caves. There's a lot about the under the earth that's very interesting. But the problem with that view, and I don't lean toward that view very much at all, to be honest, is that the script or the text talks about how it seems that this flood came very unexpectedly, and also that it talks about how it really destroyed all flesh upon the earth. So it doesn't really seem to me that there's a group of giants surviving by going under the earth. But there are people who have held to that view, and they articulate that view. That's something that could be brought up or emphasized. Now, I hold all this with a somewhat loose hand, but I lean the most toward a smaller second incursion theory of somehow. And that could be, like I said, a much smaller scale, happens just enough to kind of get it going again, but it's really not the same thing that happened in the antediluvian world. I think there's a scenario that could potentially play out there that could kind of help explain how they come back without. And obviously, if fallen angels did that after the flood, God will eventually judge them just as severely. But there's a way in which that could play out where it wouldn't be the exact same thing. God will deal with it in his time, but there's a way that that could happen where that would make sense and you could explain why giants come up again after the flood. Now, I understand the pushback with that, but I used to lean more toward the view of the genetic carriers coming through the ark. But the more I've thought about it, it's just hard for me to believe that God, who set up this whole ark as a preservative to get away from all of that, it's really hard for me to think that he let that come through in some form. Now, it's possible. I'm not completely opposed to that view necessarily, but it's not the one that I lean toward the most. So we've seen that there's a lot of implications to what's going on. And really the last thing we need to pull out of this is that we need to understand that the flood of Noah is such a pivotal moment in our history. And I think that there's been a lot of good Christians, younger Christians, who say that you can see the evidence all throughout the world. We've already talked about the legends and myths of floods all over the world. We find them in India. We find them in the Americas. We find them Europe, Asia, wherever. There are flood narratives all over. Many people think that the Grand Canyon it shows evidence of the flood, and in contrast to the evolutionary view of history that really doesn't want to consider that we see that the really massive evidence of that flood coming through probably is what caused the Grand Canyon. So there's evidence of the flood all over the place, and that we're going to see that this as civilization is going to re-emerge after the flood, and eventually after the Tower of Babel event, the peoples of the world are going to scatter. That this is an event that is ingrained in the consciousness of humanity. So we need to understand what a pivotal event this is on the earth. And when we're going to get into this, we're going to see that there's a lot of changes that come after the earth. We're going to see the Noahic covenant that we're going to talk about next week. We're going to see humanity begins to eat meat, or is allowed by God at the very least to eat meat after the flood. That's a big change that comes around. So that's why we're allowed to have our T-bone steaks and our pork chops, because the Lord allows us to eat meat after the flood. That's very interesting. And we're really going to see how the Lord is going to give the same commission that he gave to Adam to Noah, but humanity will once again fall into rebellion, and we're going to get to the Tower of Babel event, which is a very, very big event in our history. So there's a lot there. There's a lot that we need to really get into. There's a lot that we really need to understand. And these are all things that we really need to look at. And these are things that we're going to pull out of the text. So that being said, we can now just review a little bit to finish up our time today. We've seen that Noah was a good man, and he was a just man in the midst of a world that's hearts were continually on evil, and that God even said that it grieved him that he had created humanity, and he said that he wanted to destroy humanity. And we need to understand that in the biblical context, because God doesn't change his mind. We find that found all throughout the text of Scripture, that God does not change his mind, but God is communicating to us in anthropomorphic language. He is trying to convey something to us. He's conveying his anger over sin. He's conveying his displeasure over sin. And that is the world that Noah served in, was a world where the hearts of men were continually on evil. And he was able to preach and be faithful and serve the Lord even in the midst of all that rebellion and all of that evil. And that's really a fascinating thing. So we've seen in today's broadcast, we've seen that Noah was able to be faithful in the midst of the day of small things, where there were few true believers on the earth. We've seen that Noah was able to be faithful in the midst of disappointments, in the midst of heartaches, in the midst of setbacks. We've seen that Noah was able to be faithful in the midst of loneliness. And we saw that he built this great and mighty ark, made of gopher wood with pitch, and it's described with having 3 stories. And we get all this amazing detail about the ark. And we saw how, the floods came, and how the windows of heaven were open, the waters come down, the waters below, they rise up, they shoot up, and the earth is consumed by water. We've talked about the mass die-off of the plant life and the animal life, how the terrain of the world changed so drastically from the pre-flood world to the post-flood world. And we've seen that somehow these giants re-emerge on the earth. So we have so much going on here. We have so much that is being emphasized, so much that's being talked about, and this is going to set us up for next week, where we're going to get into some of the things that, like I've said before, we're going to get into the Noahic covenant. We're going to get more into Noah's 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and we're going to get more into the narrative of, eventually we're going to move more into the Tower of Babel event, which is a big event on the earth. So those are all things that we're going to pull out. Those are all things that we're going to get from the text in the weeks to come, and we're really going to start to accelerate quickly to people like Nimrod, and we're going to get into things like Job, and then we're going to start to get into the biblical patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we're going to start to see God's plan for the restoration of the earth, his plan for the redemption of the earth, moving forward to the Messiah, which is Christ. We're going to see this plan begin to become more detailed and more developed, and that's where we're going to go from there. So all that being said, this has been this edition of Reformed Truth Through Ministries. I am Joe Harper, and we have been broadcasting from the Foundations in Faith Radio Network. God bless, everybody.